The dog weighed 90 pounds of muscle and combat training, and he was going to kill someone in the next 30 seconds. The Belgian Malinois stood over the bleeding Navy SEAL on the gurney, teeth bared, a sound coming from his chest that wasn't a growl, so much as a promise. 3 doctors had already backed against the wall. A security officer had a bruised wrist from the first attempt. The ER chief was screaming for animal control. And then a nurse, quiet, overlooked, the one nobody remembered hiring, walked through the crowd and said 4 words that stopped everything cold. "I've got him." Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now because this is exactly the kind of story we tell on this channel. The ones they don't want you to know about. Hit like if you're already hooked and drop a comment with your city and country. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to that ER. The night started the way bad nights always do at Harmon Peak Medical Center. Not with one crisis, but with 6 of them arriving inside the same hour. Harmon Peak sat on the eastern edge of Caldwell, Colorado, a mid-sized city that liked to believe it was bigger than it was. The hospital had 4 trauma bays, a level 2 rating it fought to keep, and an ER staff that ran permanently short on sleep and long on institutional memory of every mistake anyone had ever made. The walls were that particular shade of green that someone in 1987 had decided was calming and that everyone since had agreed was depressing. The fluorescent lights buzzed at a frequency that, after a 12-hour shift, felt personal. Nora Voss had been on since 7 that morning. It was now 12:43 at night. She was not supposed to still be here. Her replacement had called out with a stomach thing that half the floor suspected was a hangover, and charge nurse Deborah Finch had looked at the board, looked at the available bodies, and looked at Nora with an expression that wasn't quite an apology. 2 more hours, Deborah had said. Maybe 3. That was 4 hours ago. Nora was 31 years old and had the particular brand of tiredness that doesn't show on your face so much as it settles into the way you move. Slightly slower decisions, slightly shorter responses, a fraction more economy in everything. She had dark circles she'd stopped trying to hide 2 years into this job. Brown hair she kept pulled back so tight it gave her the faint ghost of a headache by hour 10, and a face that most of her colleagues would describe, if pressed, as serious. Not unfriendly, just serious. Like she was always doing math in her head. She was frequently doing math in her head. Bay 3 had a construction worker with a compound fracture of the radius who was going to need surgical consult. Bay 1 had a 60-year-old with chest pressure that wasn't quite presenting as cardiac, but wasn't not presenting as cardiac either. Bay 7 had a 14-year-old with an asthma attack that had responded to the first treatment, but not well enough for Nora to feel comfortable, and she had mentioned this twice to Dr. Garrett Holt, who had nodded both times in a way that meant he'd heard her and would get to it when he got to it. Dr. Holt was the attending tonight. I was 53, had excellent hands, and had the conversational habit of repeating whatever the last thing someone said to him was in a slightly different order, which gave the impression of listening without requiring him to actually change anything he'd already decided. He had been chief of emergency medicine for 6 years. He did not consider Nora Voss's opinions on patient status to be significantly different from the opinions of the furniture. This was not unusual. This was Tuesday. Nora was charting at the central station when the radio crackled, not the hospital radio. The other one, the direct line frequency that only activated when someone had called ahead through channels that bypassed the regular intake desk. It happened maybe twice a year. When it happened, everyone in earshot went quiet. Deborah picked up the handset. The conversation lasted 40 seconds. When Deborah set it down, her face had the particular blankness of someone absorbing information they were not sure how to process. "Incoming trauma," she said. "Military. ETA 6 minutes. They're asking us to clear Bay 2 and have security ready." "Security for what?" asked Marcus Webb, one of the night techs, looking up from his workstation. They didn't specify. They specified when they arrived. The ambulance came in hot, and it wasn't alone. There was a dark-colored SUV behind it that parked crooked across 2 spaces and disgorged 2 men in civilian clothes who moved like they didn't understand the concept of civilian. Both of them wore earpieces. One of them had a hand resting on something under his jacket. The ambulance doors opened. The paramedics were already talking before they fully cleared the vehicle. Adult male, approximately 35, GSW to the right shoulder, and blunt chest trauma, possible pneumothorax. BP was 90/60 when we loaded, dropped to 82 on the way in, We've got 2 large-bore IVs going, but he's been conscious and fighting us the whole, and then the dog came out. He was on a short lead attached to the gurney, and the lead was the only reason he wasn't already free. The Belgian Malinois was dark-coated and low-slung and moved the way purpose-built things move. No wasted motion, every muscle doing exactly what it was designed to do. His eyes swept the ambulance bay with the quick, systematic attention of something trained to assess threats at speed. He found plenty. "Somebody take the animal," the paramedic said, not quite managing calm. He won't let us get close to..." The dog turned toward the paramedic, and the sound that came out of him stopped the sentence entirely. "Bay 2, let's move," Dr. Holt said, and the gurney started rolling, and that was when Security Officer Dale Pittman stepped forward with his hand out, reaching for the lead. The Malinois spun on him. Not a lunge, a warning. The distinction, Nora would think later, mattered. The dog knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't out of control. He was making a decision, and the decision was that nobody was taking that lead while his handler was bleeding. Pittman yanked his hand back. "Get that animal contained," Holt said without looking up from the patient. "Working on it," Pittman said, in a tone that meant he was not going to be the one who worked on it. The gurney reached Bay 2. The dog moved with it, perfectly tracking the wounded man's position, head low, eyes up. When the trauma team tried to converge, nurses, the resident, the tech with the monitor, the dog put himself between them and the gurney, and the sound from his chest dropped into something lower and more serious. 2 nurses stepped back. The resident, a third-year named Alicia Park, who Nora liked, held her ground for exactly 2 seconds before retreating to the doorway. "We cannot treat him if we can't get to him," Holt said, with the controlled annoyance of a man who did not consider this his problem to solve. "The dog needs to be removed," said the taller of the 2 civilian-clothed men from the doorway. His voice had the flattened cadence of someone accustomed to giving directives that were followed. "We can sedate him if—" "You sedate that dog," said a voice from the gurney, hoarse and half-breathed but absolutely clear in its intent, "and I will make your life very difficult." It was the first time the patient had spoken since arriving. Everyone looked at him. He was broad-shouldered, even lying down, with the particular physical construction of someone who had spent years doing things to his body that most people couldn't imagine and had the compact damage to show for it. His right shoulder was packed and wrapped, the dressing already showing through. His face was gray under the fluorescence. His eyes were focused on the ceiling with the fixed concentration of a man managing significant pain and not particularly interested in discussing it. "Commander," the civilian man said, "we need the medical team to—" "I heard you." The patient, the commander apparently, exhaled slowly. "Tack, down." The dog looked at him. "Down," the commander said again, quieter. The Malinois dropped to a crouch beside the gurney, not lying flat, not releasing attention, but no longer actively blocking. It was the minimum compliance the word required and nothing beyond it. The trauma team moved in, carefully. The dog tracked every person who touched the commander but held position, and for approximately 4 minutes, it looked like this was going to work. Then Dr. Holt reached across the commander's chest to palpate the left side, and his arm brushed the dog's lead, and the lead shifted, and Tack came up off the floor like a spring releasing. He didn't bite. He positioned, body between Holt and the commander, head up, noise escalating from warning to something that in the wild would have meant run. Holt froze. "Get this animal out of my trauma bay," he said, very quietly, which with Holt was worse than shouting. Pittman tried again with a catch pole someone had retrieved from somewhere. That went poorly. The pole hit the floor. Pittman had his back against the wall with the Malinois 3 feet in front of him, and the room had the particular stillness of a situation that was 2 bad decisions away from someone getting seriously hurt. "Everyone stop moving," said a voice from the doorway. Nora had not meant to say it that loudly. The room turned toward her. She was still holding the chart she'd been updating at the station when the commotion peaked. She'd been watching from the hallway for the last 90 seconds, long enough to see what the team was doing wrong and why it wasn't going to get better on its own. "Nurse Voss," Holt said, with the particular flatness of a man whose authority he felt was being encroached upon by the wrong kind of person. "This does not require—" "He's not aggressive," Nora said, walking forward. She was talking to the room but looking at the dog. "He's positional. There's a difference. If you keep trying to remove him, You're going to get someone bitten because you're confirming every threat assessment he's making. That is not your department, Holt said. No, Nora agreed, still moving. My department is keeping that man alive long enough to treat him, and right now that's not happening, so. She heard Pittman mutter something. She heard Alicia Park make a quiet sound that might have been disbelief. She heard the taller civilian man say, in a low voice to his partner, "Who is that?" She heard none of it the way you hear things that matter. She was 4 feet from the Malinois. The dog had tracked her the moment she entered the bay. She'd felt it, that specific quality of animal attention that's different from human attention, heavier somehow, more total. He was reading her the way trained dogs read everything: speed, posture, the minute signals that bodies give off when they're afraid or angry or something else. She kept her hands loose and visible. She didn't look directly at his eyes. She let him take inventory. 3 feet. The dog's chest was still moving with that low, continuous sound, but the register had shifted slightly. She was close enough now to see his eyes clearly. High drive, focused, intelligent in the way of working animals who've been shaped by intensive training into something that walks the line between instinct and instruction. He knew what he was doing. He always had. She stopped, 2.5 feet. "Hey," she said, quietly. Not at the dog, exactly. More like into the space between them. I know you don't know me. I know this is wrong and loud and it smells wrong and he's hurt, and you've been doing this for hours probably. I know." The dog's head tilted. A fraction of a degree, just enough. She crouched down to his level. She could feel the attention of everyone in the room pressing on her back like a hand. "I'm going to say something," she said, still quiet, still not looking directly at him. "And if I'm wrong about what I think I know about you, then Pittman over there is going to have a very exciting evening." She heard Pittman shift nervously. "Good." She looked at the dog's left ear, the working side, the command side, the side she knew from years of muscle memory that she wasn't supposed to know anymore. "Tak," she said. "Sitz, Platz, Ruhe." The German came out of her without effort. Sit, down, rest. The Malinois looked at her for a long moment, long enough that she felt the sweat on the back of her neck. And then he sat. Then he folded to the floor. His head came to rest on his forepaws, and he exhaled, a long, controlled breath, and the sound in his chest reduced to something that was more waiting than warning. The trauma bay was completely silent. Nora stood up. She turned to the trauma team, and something in her face must have changed because Alicia Park took a small, unconscious step backward. "He'll hold that as long as nobody makes a sudden move toward the patient without announcing first," Nora said. "I'll stay in the bay. Let's get to work." Dr. Holt stared at her. Across the bay from the gurney, the commander turned his head. He looked at Nora with eyes that were clearer now. The pain still there, but below it something else. Recognition, or the edge of it. Something that moved across his face like weather. "Who are you?" he said. It wasn't quite the right question, and she could tell he knew it wasn't the right question, because almost immediately something shifted behind his eyes, like he'd said the wrong word and meant another. "Nora Voss," she said. "I'm one of the nurses." He held her gaze for another second. "Voss," he said, like he was checking the weight of it. "Commander," the civilian man said sharply from the doorway. "We should—" "Yeah," the commander said, not looking away from Nora. "We should." He closed his eyes. The team moved in, and Nora stood at the foot of the gurney with Tak at her left side and her hands folded in front of her, and she watched them work, and she did not let herself think about where she'd learned those commands, or why a military working dog, certified under a program that officially did not exist, had responded to her voice like she was someone he was supposed to know. She did not let herself think about that. She focused on the commander's vitals, on the monitor. Systolic holding at 86. Heart rate elevated but regular. The chest was the concern. Holt was calling for a portable X-ray and a thoracic surgeon consult, and she agreed with both, and she filed that away as she filed everything away, in the part of her brain that ran parallel to the part that was staying very quiet about other things. The thoracic consult came back in 22 minutes. The chest film showed a partial collapse that hadn't fully declared itself yet. A small hemothorax, blood pooling at the base. Not immediately life-threatening, but pointed in a direction that required intervention. They moved the commander to the OR at 2:17 in the morning. Tak watched him go. He didn't follow. He sat at the bay entrance as the gurney rolled toward the elevator, and he tracked it until it turned the corner, and then he turned and looked at Nora. "I know," she said. She crouched down and put her hand out, palm up. The dog leaned his forehead against her fingers for exactly 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds something moved across her chest that she didn't have a name for and didn't try to find one. "He's going to come back," she told the dog. "They're taking good care of him." Behind her she heard footsteps. "That was impressive," said the taller civilian man. She stood up. He was close, maybe 6 feet, and up close she could see he was older than she'd initially registered, mid-40s, with a military bearing that he'd clearly decided he no longer needed to disguise. He needed a familiar command structure, Nora said. Once he had that, he was fine. German commands, Schutzhund Foundation, specific vocal cadence. The man's eyes hadn't moved from her face. "That's not something you pick up from a YouTube video, Nurse Voss." "I did some research," she said. "German Shepherd handler in my neighborhood, when I was young." The lie was smooth. She'd had years to make it smooth. The man looked at her for a moment that was exactly 1 beat too long. "Of course," he said. His name, she learned over the next hour, was Warren Slade. He was described in the paperwork as a federal liaison, a designation that could mean 17 different things and usually meant something it wasn't supposed to. His partner, who spoke approximately 8 words across the entire night, was listed as Agent Torres. They stayed. That was the thing that should have told her something. Most federal escorts handed off at the hospital and left. These two took up position in the waiting area outside the OR and did not move. At 4 in the morning, Nora finished her extended shift, clocked out, changed, and walked to her car in the staff lot. She sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. That was one of the things that had made her good at the job she used to have, the one she'd spent 4 years building an entirely different person to not be. She sat there for 7 minutes. Then she took out her phone. She scrolled to a number that she had not dialed in 2 years, that she kept in her contacts under a name that was just a string of numbers, that she had hoped she would never need. She did not dial it. She put the phone back in her pocket. She started the car. Because Warren Slade had looked at her the way people looked at someone they already knew the answer to, and the commander had said her name like it was a test he wasn't sure she'd pass, and a military working dog trained in a program that didn't exist had folded to the floor on her German command. And none of that was coincidence. And she had 48 hours, maybe less, before whoever sent them to this hospital sent someone else. She pulled out of the lot. The Colorado dark swallowed the car whole. She drove 3 miles before she realized she'd taken the long way home without deciding to. Old habit, route variation. Don't establish patterns. Don't let patterns establish themselves. She'd spent 4 years trying to unlearn that particular reflex, and here it was, alive and automatic, surfacing the moment the situation required it, like muscle memory doesn't actually forget anything. It just waits. She corrected course at the next light. Took the direct road. Made herself do it. Her apartment was on the 4th floor of a building on Crestline Avenue that had decent bones and a broken elevator that the management company fixed and then unfixed on a rotating cycle. She took the stairs, which she always took anyway, and unlocked her door and stood in the dark kitchen for a moment without turning on the lights. 4 years. 4 years of grocery shopping and staff meetings and learning which attending liked their patients presented in what order and which coffee machine in the break room actually worked. 4 years of building a life that was small and specific and hers, brick by brick, in a city she'd chosen because she knew nobody there and nobody knew her, which at the time had felt like the only thing she needed. She turned on the light. She made coffee she probably shouldn't drink at 4:15 in the morning, stood at her kitchen counter, and thought about Warren Slade's eyes. He'd been checking her. Not casually. Methodically. The kind of look that had already done the background work and was now in the verification stage, comparing what he was seeing against what he already believed to be true. She'd seen that look before. She'd given that look before. The question was what he'd found. Her cover was good. She'd been careful. Not just careful, but thorough in the particular way that comes from understanding exactly how these things got unraveled, because she'd been on the other side of that process before. Nora Voss had a complete history. Nursing degree from a real school, transcripts that reflected actual coursework, References who remembered her because they'd actually taught someone by that name in a program she'd slipped into with carefully arranged documentation. Her social security number had a history. Her apartment had a lease going back 4 years. She paid taxes. She had a dental record. She had made herself real. But she had also, tonight, spoken German commands from a classified training program to a military working dog who was not supposed to exist in a program that was not supposed to exist. And she had done it fluently and without hesitation, and Warren Slade had watched every syllable. She poured the coffee out. Her stomach wouldn't handle it right now. She went to bed without sleeping and was back at the hospital by 6:45 child. The morning shift had the particular texture of a night that had happened to everyone. Slightly frayed at the edges, conversations shorter than usual, the kind of collective tiredness that made the break room quieter and the hallways louder than the normal inverse. Word had gotten around about the military patient and the dog, because word always got around. Harmon Peak was not a large hospital. By the time Nora arrived, she'd already mentally prepared for the questions. What she hadn't prepared for was Deborah Finch meeting her at the locker room door with her arms crossed and her expression set to a particular frequency that meant the night had continued without Nora and had not improved. "He's in the ICU," Deborah said. "Stable as of an hour ago. The thoracic team drained the hemothorax, lung re-expanded. He came out of anesthesia around 5. Good. The dog is in the ICU waiting area. Someone brought him a water bowl. Nobody's sure who. Also good. Administration wants to talk to you." Nora finished hanging up her jacket. She already knew what this was about. About the dog. About the dog. And about you specifically. Deborah paused, which was unusual. Deborah Finch did not typically pause. She processed information and moved. "There was a request this morning, through official channels, very polite, very documented, for your personnel file. HR director came in at 6 in the morning. That has happened exactly once before in this hospital's history, and it involved a malpractice suit that cost them $4 million. Who made the request? That's what's making everyone nervous. The name on the paperwork isn't attached to any acronym that our legal department has been able to verify, which means either it's a very small agency or it's a very careful person operating through channels that legal doesn't have a reference for." Deborah's professional neutrality was working hard, visibly. "Nora, is there something I should know?" It was a real question. 11 years as charge nurse meant Deborah had earned the right to ask it, and she was asking it now with the specific plainness of someone who would handle the answer, whatever it was. "Not yet," Nora said. "Give me a few hours." Deborah held her gaze for 2 full seconds. Then she nodded and stepped aside. She got to the ICU waiting area at 7:20. Tack was in the corner, positioned with his back toward the wall and his sight line on the door. And he'd been in that exact position for what she estimated was 5 or 6 hours based on the indentation in the institutional carpet and the slight lean in his haunches. Working dogs could hold an alert position for extraordinary lengths of time. It was one of the things that made them useful, and one of the things that, when you trained alongside them, made you feel vaguely ashamed of your own capacity for patience. He lifted his head when she came through. The shift in his posture was minimal. A degree of relaxation around the shoulders, the faintest orientation toward her. But she'd spent enough time reading animal body language to know that for Tack, this was the equivalent of a handshake. Agent Torres was in a chair by the window. He had the awake but depleted look of someone running on the wrong side of 24 hours. And he watched her cross the room with the expression of a man who'd been told to be professional about something he hadn't fully decided about yet. "He's been asking for a status update," Torres said. "On the dog, and on you." "He can have both." She looked at Torres steadily. "Is he up for a short conversation?" Torres stood, which she took as a yes, and gestured toward the ICU door with the minimal efficiency of someone who'd stopped wasting motion somewhere around hour 18. The ICU had 4 bays, and Commander David Harker was in the far one. Security placement, she noted, farthest from the entrance, most sight lines covered, single point of approach. Someone had thought about it. His chart was on the tablet outside the curtain. She scanned it in about 40 seconds. Chest drain output had slowed appropriately, vitals were stabilizing. He'd refused the full sedation protocol in recovery and taken the minimum, which explained why he was awake at 7 in the morning after surgery and why his pain numbers were higher than they should have been for someone with his chart. She pushed through the curtain. He was lying at a slight incline with the chest drain visible at his left side and monitoring leads running to a unit beside the bed. The color had come back into his face in small amounts, still gray at the edges, but with more substance underneath. His eyes were open, and they tracked her entrance with the particular economy of someone doing assessment work, even when assessment work was objectively not what they should be doing. "Tack's fine," she said, before he could ask, holding a position in the waiting room that I would describe as militarily appropriate. Something shifted in Harker's face, not quite a smile. The relief that lives under where smiles happen. "That's Tack," he said. His voice was rough from the intubation tube, but clearer than last night. "You doing the dog welfare check first was either very thoughtful or a strategic move to establish goodwill before the hard questions." "It was both," she said. He looked at her. "Honest. When it doesn't cost me anything." She pulled up the tablet to check his overnight numbers. Not because she needed to establish a clinical reason to be here, but because it was true. She did want to check his numbers. His oxygen saturation was at 94, which was acceptable but on the low side for someone post-intervention. She made a note. "How's the pain?" "Present?" "That's not a number." "6, he said. "Maybe 7 when I breathe deep. I'm not breathing deep on purpose. That's going to cause secondary problems. You need to use the spirometer." "I know." "Are you going to?" A pause. "Probably not enthusiastically." "I'll send someone with it in an hour." She set the tablet down. "You told me last night that 3 people knew the full extraction route. 1 is dead, 1 is you." She kept her voice the same, clinical even. "Who was the third?" Harker's expression didn't change in any way she could precisely identify, but the quality of his stillness did. "That's not a nursing question," he said. "No? Why are you asking it?" "Because someone requested my personnel file this morning through a channel that my hospital's legal department can't identify. And Warren Slade was in the hallway outside the ICU when I arrived, and I'd like to understand the shape of what I'm standing in the middle of." She met his gaze. "If you'd rather not answer, I'll do my job and leave." He held the look for a long moment. The monitors beeped their steady rhythm. Outside the curtain, she could hear the ICU ambient, low voices, a cart moving, the controlled hush of a place designed to manage critical states. "Her name is Major Petra Wolf," he said. "She was the intelligence officer who built the mission parameters. Target location, extraction route, timing windows, all of it came through her. She has a clearance level that most people in my unit don't have access to, which means she had access to things most people in my unit didn't have access to." He stopped. "She was also the officer who certified the intelligence package on an operation 4.5 years ago that went very wrong." Nora said nothing. "A recovery mission," Harker said, watching her face. "Wrong coordinates. Team ambushed. 3 KIA and 1... He stopped. "1 listed as missing, then KIA. The monitors kept beeping. "I didn't make that connection until I was already in the vehicle last night," he said. "And by then the mission was already compromised." His jaw was tight in a way that wasn't entirely about the chest drain. "I sent a 6-digit emergency authentication to 4 people 40 minutes before it went sideways. It was the only thing I could think to do that might reach someone who'd understand it without tipping anyone in the communication chain." "Who received it?" "Torres. Slade. A contact who's now dead." He paused. "And a name that officially doesn't exist." The room was very quiet. "Slade showed up at the extraction point," Nora said. "He did, which could mean he responded to the authentication, or it could mean he's the wrong person to have received it." Harker's voice was flat. "I've been running that calculation since I got here. I can't resolve it from a hospital bed." "Torres trusts him." "Torres trusts him," Harker confirmed, "which is either the correct instinct or the thing that gets us both killed." He exhaled carefully. "I don't have enough to know. That's the honest answer. I don't have enough to know." It was the kind of admission that cost something to make. She could see that. Men like Harker were built around having enough information to act. Acknowledging the absence of it was a specific kind of exposure. She picked up the tablet again, not looking at it. "Get some rest," she said. "Use the spirometer." "Nurse Voss." She stopped. "The personnel file request," he said. "If Slade made that request because he knows what I think he knows, about you, about what you were before this, then he's either a problem or the only resource we have." He held her gaze. I don't know which, but I think you might be able to tell. She didn't answer that. She walked out. The rest of the morning moved in the way mornings moved in the ER. Structured chaos with brief intervals of just chaos. She saw patients. She caught a medication error on a chart that would have been a serious problem in approximately 6 hours if uncaught. She helped Alicia Park with a line placement in Bay 4 and noted, not for the first time, that Alicia had the instincts for this work, even if her hands weren't fully confident yet. That confidence would come. It always came at different speeds for different people. She filed her notes. She answered questions from Dr. Holt, who spoke to her in the morning with the particular careful courtesy of a man who had watched her do something he couldn't explain and had decided the most dignified response was to pretend it hadn't happened. She let him. Under all of it, she was running the other calculation. Petra Wolf. She knew that name. Not from here, not from Nora Voss's 4 years of building a small and careful life, but from before. She knew it from the same place she knew Schutzen commands and extraction protocols, and the way you held your body when you were trying to convince a room full of people that you were less than you were. Major Petra Wolf had been 3 levels above Sarah Vasquez in the command structure. She'd been the intelligence authority on 2 operations Sarah's unit had run, including the last one, the one with the wrong coordinates. Sarah had never had a name for what happened that night. She'd had a suspicion that lived in her chest like a piece of glass, sharp when she moved wrong, always there. But a suspicion wasn't a name. Now she had a name. She was walking back from the pharmacy at 10:45, turning this over with the controlled focus of someone who'd learned to do processing work while appearing to do other things, when she came around the corner and saw Slade in the hallway outside the ICU. He was standing with his back to the wall, phone at his ear, but his eyes were already on her by the time she registered him. He'd seen her first. He tracked the hallway the way people tracked things when their attention was already distributed across more than one task. She kept her pace. Walked toward him, because walking away from a man running a visual assessment of you was a kind of answer. He lowered his phone as she stopped a few feet away. Nurse Voss, he said. Mr. Slade. Interesting morning. He said it without inflection. I understand there's been some administrative activity around your personnel file. I heard that too. Standard procedure when we secure a facility around a patient. We want to understand who has regular access. He said it reasonably, as though they were both performing a conversation they both knew was a different conversation. Of course, she said. He looked at her for a moment that ran one beat past comfortable. In the ICU hallway's fluorescent daylight, she could see more of him. The jaw that had healed slightly off-center, the eyes that had the specific flatness of someone who'd spent years in environments where emotional legibility was a liability. He was good at his job. She could tell that the way you could tell certain things about people who'd worked in the same world, a fluency in the same language. You know what I find interesting? He said. You'll tell me either way. So. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite amusement. A nurse with no listed military background who executes a full 3-step Schützenruhe sequence in correct German, correct intonation, and with a vocal cadence that dogs trained in that specific protocol are conditioned to respond to. He let that sit. That's not something you find in a YouTube tutorial. I've explained my background with working dogs. You have, and it's a very pleasant explanation. He shifted slightly, adjusting his weight. The program those commands originated from has been classified since it was closed 3 years ago. The 3-step RU sequence was introduced 18 months into the program's operation following an internal revision. It never appeared in any published material. It was known to 41 people. He paused. 37 of those people have current verified assignments. 2 are deceased. 1 is a contractor in Georgia. He stopped. 1 was listed as killed in action 4.5 years ago on a mission that, as it turns out, I've been looking at for the last 8 months. The hallway stayed empty around them. That's a significant amount of research for a hospital background check, she said. I did it in about 4 hours, he said, which tells you what I think last night's voice command performance was. He tilted his head slightly. The KIA on the program roster is listed as Lieutenant Sarah Vasquez, Air Force Combat Medic, Special Operations Rescue Attachment, top 3% on military working dog handler evaluations. He watched her face with the patience of someone who'd already decided to wait as long as necessary. She was on a recovery mission 4.5 years ago, Bad intelligence, wrong coordinates. Team walked into a prepared ambush. She kept her breathing even. She'd had practice at keeping her breathing even. The intelligence package for that mission was certified by one person, Slade said, and that same person certified the package for Commander Harker's mission last night. He paused. I've been trying to build a case against Major Petra Wolf for 11 months. The problem is that everything she does is clean at the surface. The intelligence failures look like bad luck, not intent. The timing coincidences have explanations. There's nothing that individually constitutes proof. His voice stayed quiet and even. The documents Harker was trying to recover last night would have changed that. They would have contained communication records that connect Wolf to an external network she's been running for years. And they were destroyed, Nora said, before extraction. Someone got to the location first. He looked at her. Someone who knew the exact coordinates and timing window. Information that only existed in Wolf's certified mission package. The air between them had changed quality. It had the weight of a room where something important was happening, and both people in the room knew it. What do you want from me? She said. I want to know if Lieutenant Vasquez survived the ambush, he said. Not officially. I've seen the official record. I'm asking whether the person standing in front of me, who speaks classified German K9 commands, and drove a specific route variation pattern out of the staff parking lot at 4 in the morning, is someone who has been living under a constructed identity for 4 years and might be the only surviving witness to what Wolf's network has been doing since before it destroyed her team. The ICU door was behind her, 12 feet. That's a large inference, she said. It's a very well-supported inference. He held her gaze. I'm not here to pull anyone out of a life they've built. I'm here because Harker is in a hospital bed, and the person who put him there knows he's alive and knows this building's location. And Torres and I are running a facility check on a building we don't know, looking for someone who's professionally invisible. He paused. I need someone who knows this floor. Every entrance, every exit, every place someone with a medical credential could stand and not look wrong. She looked at him for a long moment. Which side are you on? She said. It wasn't quite a question. Harker's, he said, without hesitation. 11 months ago, Harker found a thread in an operation that got 3 of his people killed. He's been pulling it since then. The authentication code he sent last night. He sent it to 4 people because he trusted 4 people in the world at that point. I was one of them. He met her eyes. The code was a distress signal from a program that officially ended 8 years ago. Most people wouldn't recognize it. I recognized it because I helped design it. She held that. Who was the contact who died? She said. Something moved through Slade's face. Brief, controlled, but real. His name was Orrin Tate. He was a signals analyst. He'd been feeding Harker corroborating data on the Wolf case for 6 months. He paused. He was found this morning. The word this morning landed with a weight she felt in her sternum. Time of death, she said. Estimated between 2 and 4 this morning. His voice was steady, but the steadiness was costing something now. Which puts it after Harker's transport location entered the system at OH300. She turned and looked at the ICU door. Whoever Wolf has in motion, Slade said behind her. They're already working. They have the location. They have a window before we establish a real security perimeter. He paused. We have Torres, who is running the 2nd floor right now, and who doesn't know the layout well enough to be fast. We have me. And we have... He stopped. We have whatever you decide to be in the next few minutes. She stood there with the ICU door in front of her, and 11 months of Slade's investigation in her ears, and the specific glass-sharp feeling in her chest that she'd carried for 4.5 years. The one that was a suspicion shaped like a name she'd never been able to say. Petra Wolf. Walk me through what Torres has found so far, she said, turning back to him. Slade reached into his jacket for his phone, and behind them, from inside the ICU, through the closed door, clear enough to hear in the hallway, every monitor in David Harker's bay triggered a simultaneous alarm. Not the steady rhythm of routine monitoring adjusting, the flat, continuous tone of a system responding to something that had stopped. Nora was through the ICU door before the alarm finished its first cycle. Not running. Running in a hospital ICU created secondary problems, knocked things over, startled other patients, told everyone in the unit that something was wrong before you had any information about what wrong actually meant. She moved fast, purposeful, the specific controlled velocity of someone who understood that speed without information was just panic with better footwork. Slade was half a step behind her and had the sense not to get ahead of her in a building he didn't know. The curtain to Harker's bay was already being pulled back by the night ICU nurse, a compact woman in her 40s named Renata Dunn, who Nora knew by reputation as someone who didn't rattle easily. Renata wasn't rattled now, but she was moving with the tightened efficiency of someone whose assessment had found something she didn't like. BP dropped, Renata said, already at the monitor. 68/40. Heart rate's up. 112. He was fine 20 minutes ago. Nora was at the bedside. Harker was conscious, which was something. His eyes were open and tracking, and he had the gray-white look of someone whose body was doing its own math and arriving at concerning answers, but he was present. "Hey," she said. "Stay with me. Where's the pain?" "Chest," he said. "Left side. Sharp." He exhaled through his teeth. Different than before. Different than before meant different from the surgical site. She put her hands on him. Sternal pressure, listening to his breathing on the left side, and she heard it immediately. The diminished breath sounds that hadn't been there 90 minutes ago when she'd checked his chart. Her mind ran the differential automatically, the way it ran things automatically now after 4 years of doing this work with genuine attention. Reaccumulation of the hemothorax, tension pneumothorax, drain occlusion. She looked at the chest drain. Output had been slowing appropriately through the morning. Too slow, actually. The tube itself. "The drain's kinked," she said. Renata, I need..." Already paging thoracic. Renata was at the phone. "And I need the setup for drain repositioning now, before thoracic gets here, because his pressure is not going to wait." She was already adjusting the tubing, tracing the kink. There, at the exit point, a fold that had tightened as Harker shifted position in the bed, creating a partial occlusion that had been building pressure on the wrong side of his chest for probably the last 40 minutes. Classic. Preventable. The kind of thing that happened in busy ICUs when patients who'd been told not to move moved because they were stubborn or in pain or both. "Don't move," she told Harker. "I mean it this time." "I'm not moving," he said through his teeth. "You moved. That's why we're here." "I needed the..." He stopped. A brief expression of something that in a healthier moment might have been sheepishness. "The spirometer." She stared at him. "You told me to use it," he said. "I told you to use it, not to reposition yourself to reach it without calling someone." She had the kink corrected now. Tubing straightened, secured, watching the drain chamber for the output to resume. It did slowly, and the monitor above them began its incremental adjustment, heart rate starting to come down. Not fast, but the direction was right. Behind her, she heard Slade at the curtain, and she heard Torres coming through from the hallway, and she heard Renata on the phone with thoracic explaining the situation in the clipped shorthand of a nurse who'd made 100 of these calls and knew exactly which words moved people faster. "It's going to take about 10 minutes for the pressure to equalize," Nora told Harker. "Thoracic will want to look at the placement. You're going to be okay, but you need to not move at all. And I mean that in a way I should have been more forceful about earlier." "Noted," he said. His color was still bad, but slightly less catastrophic. "If you need something, you call. You don't reach." "I understand the concept." "Do you?" She looked at him. "Because I've had this exact conversation with patients who absolutely understood the concept and then immediately reached for something. Something that wasn't quite a smile crossed his face. "Fair." She stepped back and let Renata in to recheck vitals, and she turned to find Slade standing at the curtain with his phone in his hand and an expression that had tightened considerably in the last 4 minutes. "It wasn't the drain," he said quietly. Not a question. "It was the drain," she said. He moved to use the spirometer and kinked the tube. "You're sure?" She looked at him. "Yes. It's a mechanical complication from patient repositioning. I've seen it 3 times. She paused. "What did you think it was?" Slade held her gaze for a moment. "Torres found something on the 2nd floor." She stepped out of the bay and away from Renata's earshot. "What?" she said. "A service elevator keycard that was used at OH 642 this morning. Emergency maintenance access. The card was issued to a facilities contractor who, according to building records, hasn't been assigned to this hospital in 7 months." Torres had appeared at Slade's shoulder. She hadn't heard him come in, which told her something about how quietly he moved. He was holding a printed card sleeve in a gloved hand. The elevator accesses the ICU floor directly from the service level. That elevator hasn't worked in 3 weeks, Nora said. Both men looked at her. The facilities team has been waiting on a parts order. The car is stuck on the basement level. You can swipe all the valid keycards you want. It won't move. She processed this, which means whoever used that card either didn't know the elevator was out of service or used the card to access the stairwell adjacent to the elevator shaft, which connects to the ICU floor landing. Is the stairwell locked from the ICU side? Torres said. It's supposed to be. There's a badge reader. She thought about it. The badge reader on that door has been glitching since last month. Facilities put a work order in. It's on the same parts backlog as the elevator. A silence. So the ICU stairwell door, Slade said, opens from the service side without a valid badge. If you know it's glitching, if you know to push it at the right angle. She looked at them both. That's not information that's on any posted notice. It's floor knowledge. People who work here know it. Or people who did their homework, Torres said. How long ago was the keycard swiped? She said. 40 minutes. 40 minutes. She thought about the timeline. The alarm on Harker's monitors had pulled her in here 7 minutes ago. Before that, she'd been in the hallway with Slade for approximately 6 minutes. Before that, she'd been at the pharmacy, then walking the ER corridor. She ran the building in her head, the layout she'd moved through for 4 years until it was as automatic as breathing. The stairwell door, the ICU landing, the distance from the landing to Harker's bay. 40 minutes was enough time to get into position and wait, or to get into position and decide not to act yet. The card was used once, she said. One entry log, Torres confirmed, no exit log. He shook his head, which meant whoever had come through that door was still in the building. Thoracic surgery arrived 9 minutes later in the form of Dr. Yusuf Kamara, who was 61 years old and had the particular energy of a man who'd been doing surgery since before some of his residents were born, and had very specific feelings about being paged to correct what he considered post-operative management issues. He swept into Harker's bay, reviewed the monitor data, looked at the drain, and looked at Nora. You straightened it, he said. Pressure was dropping, she said. He made the sound of a man who was not going to say thank you, but also was not going to say anything else on the subject. He did a thorough assessment, repositioned the drain by 2 centimeters, and secured it in a way that would require deliberate effort to kink again. He spoke to Renata in low, rapid sentences about monitoring parameters. He did not speak to Nora again, which was consistent with their entire professional relationship and suited her fine. While Kamara worked, Nora stood in the hallway outside the bay and kept her eyes on the ICU entrance and thought. Whoever had come through the stairwell door 40 minutes ago was either on this floor or had exited by another route. The ICU had 3 possible exit points from the main corridor, the main entrance she'd come through, the stairwell door at the service end, and the fire exit at the east corridor that required a key and alarmed when opened. If the fire exit had alarmed, someone would have responded. No one had, which left the main entrance or the stairwell. The stairwell door was 40 feet from where she was standing, at the end of the ICU corridor, past the nurse's station and the supply alcove and the family waiting area that connected to the main hallway. She knew this floor. She knew it in the way you knew a building after 4 years. Not as a map, but as a body, the way you knew your own kitchen in the dark. She also knew that the supply alcove had a sightline problem. You couldn't see it from the nurse's station. She'd reported that twice to facilities as a security concern and been told it was on the assessment list. She looked at Torres, who was standing near the ICU entrance. The supply alcove, she said. End of this corridor, east side, before the stairwell door. Can you see it from where you are? Torres turned and looked. No. Nobody can see it from the station either. She kept her voice flat. It's got a 4-foot blind spot from both directions if you're standing in the right position inside it. Torres put his hand inside his jacket. Don't draw in the ICU, she said. There are 3 other patients on this floor. His hand stayed where it was, but he didn't pull. What do you want to do? She thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. I'm going to walk to the supply station. Normal pace, clinical reason. If someone's in that alcove, they'll see a nurse doing her job. It won't trigger action. She paused. If they're not there, we know they've moved and we extend the search outward. And if they are there, Torres said, then I need you at the stairwell door before they reach it, and I need Slade at the main entrance, and I need you both to do it without looking like you're doing it. She looked at Torres steadily. Can you do that? A brief pause. Yes. Give me 90 seconds from when I start walking. She walked. She kept her pace at the specific, unhurried cadence of a nurse moving between tasks. Not slow enough to look purposeful, not fast enough to look urgent. She picked up a tablet from the nurse's station as she passed, which gave her a clinical prop and a reason to be looking down and then looking up. The ICU corridor was 38 feet long. She'd walked it hundreds of times. She counted her steps without counting them. The supply alcove was a three-sided recess in the east wall, about 8 feet deep, lined with shelving units for IV supplies, spare monitor leads, dressing kits. The mouth of it was 2 feet wide. To see inside it, you had to be directly in front of it, which meant you were also directly in front of anyone standing inside it. She stopped at the shelving unit on the near wall, the last position before the alcove mouth, and reached for a box of IV dressings she didn't need. Her back was to the alcove. She could feel the spatial geometry of it behind her, the way you felt spaces when you'd trained in them, the volume of air, the acoustics, the tiny sounds that bodies made when they were trying not to make sounds. She heard breathing. Not Renata, not a patient, not corridor ambient. Specific, controlled. The breathing of someone managing their respiratory rate intentionally. 2 feet behind her right shoulder. She did not turn around. She took the dressing kit, noted something on the tablet, and turned left, away from the alcove, toward the nurse's station. Normal pace. Her heart was going at about 110, and she was managing it the same way the person behind her was managing their breathing, with the mechanical focus of someone who'd been trained to keep their body from announcing what their mind was doing. She reached the nurse's station and set down the tablet and looked at Renata, who was updating a chart. "I need you to take your break now," Nora said. "Go down the hall to the family waiting area and stay there for 15 minutes. Renata looked up. "Now," Nora said, quietly. Renata read her face. She stood, took her phone, and walked toward the main ICU entrance without asking a single question, which was why Nora respected her. She turned back to the monitor at the station, keeping her body angle casual, and she pulled out her phone and sent a single text to the number Slade had given her in the hallway. "Alcove. Now. Don't come from the corridor side." The response came back in 11 seconds. Confirmed. 60 seconds. She needed 60 seconds to not do anything that changed the situation. She leaned on the counter and looked at a monitor screen and counted seconds in her head and thought about angles. The alcove person had two options: the stairwell door 40 feet to their left, or the main ICU entrance 60 feet to their right, behind which Torres was now positioned. The math of the space meant that moving toward either exit required passing through the corridor and open sight line for at least 15 feet, unless they didn't move yet, unless they were waiting. She thought about why someone would come into the ICU early and wait rather than act immediately, and the answer arrived in her chest like cold water. They weren't here yet for Harker. They were here to confirm the layout, to time the nursing rotations, to identify which personnel had access to the bay, what the response time looked like, how long it took staff to reach the bed from the station. They were here to plan, which meant the actual event was later, which meant she had an opportunity she hadn't had 30 seconds ago. She heard the stairwell door at the end of the corridor open, Slade coming through from the service side, and she heard it because she was listening for it and because Slade opened it with the minimum force required, but it made a sound, and the sound was enough. The breathing in the alcove changed. She turned. A man in maintenance-issue gray coveralls stepped out of the alcove at a walk that was trying to be casual and was about 8% too fast to succeed. Medium height, mid-40s, a badge clipped to his chest that she clocked as wrong from 10 feet. Wrong color border, wrong font, the kind of wrong that took a second to process because it was almost right. He'd already assessed the corridor and chosen left, toward the stairwell, toward Slade, which meant he hadn't seen Slade come through yet. "Excuse me," she said. He kept walking. "Sir?" Louder. Clinical authority, the voice she used with patients who were confused or resistant. "This is a restricted floor. Can I see your work order?" He stopped. He turned around, and she saw his face make the calculation. Nurse alone, no security visible, stairwell behind him, main entrance behind her. She watched him do the math, and she watched him land on the wrong answer. "Sorry, wrong floor," he said. His voice was flat, a nothing accent, deliberately neutral. "Work orders have to be logged at the nursing station before any maintenance access on this level," she said. She stayed exactly where she was. It's hospital policy. I'll need to see your policy. I'll need to see your order. He looked at her for a moment that was 2 seconds too long for someone who was actually on the wrong floor, and then his eyes moved over her shoulder. Slade was at the end of the corridor. The man turned back toward the main entrance, and Torres stepped through the ICU door. The three of them formed a triangle with the man at the center, and the man understood this in the way people understood tactical geometry when they'd been trained to read it, which told Nora something about him that the coveralls and the fake badge hadn't. He looked at her. She looked back. "The work order," she said. He reached into his front pocket, and she thought, for a half-second, work order. But Torres was already moving because Torres had the same training reflex and read the reach differently, and then it was fast. Torres had the man's arm, Slade covered the exit, and the man made one sharp attempt to break the hold that Torres absorbed with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this before, and then it was over. On the floor near the alcove mouth, a phone had slid out from the pocket that hadn't contained a work order. A burner. Screen cracked from the fall, still lit. Nora picked it up with the dressing kit wrapper from her pocket, not touching the screen directly, and looked at the display. It was open to a photograph of the ICU layout. Bay 4 marked with a red circle, annotated with a time, 1400 hours. She looked up at Torres, who had the man controlled against the wall. Then she looked at the timestamp on her own phone. It was 11:22 in the morning. They had 2 hours and 38 minutes before whatever came next arrived. And this man on the wall was the advance element, not the event itself, which meant there was at least one more person, possibly more, who didn't know yet that the advance element had been pulled. And then Slade's phone rang. He looked at the screen and something moved across his face that she hadn't seen there before. A brief, unguarded expression that resolved back into control almost immediately, but not quite fast enough. He turned away from her to answer it. She heard him say, in a voice carefully stripped of everything, "Yes." A pause. Then, "When?" Another pause, longer. He lowered the phone and stood with his back to her for a moment, which was a moment she noticed, and then he turned around. "That was the federal contact coordinating the Wolf investigation," he said. His voice was steady, in the way voices were steady when they were being made to be. "Major Petra Wolf's security badge was logged entering Caldwell city limits 40 minutes ago." He paused. "She's not supposed to be in Colorado." Nora looked at him. "Her last logged assignment was a base in Virginia," he said. "She has no authorized travel to this region. Her command doesn't have her listed as deployed anywhere." He looked at the man Torres had against the wall, then back at Nora. "She's here off book, which means this." He gestured at the corridor, at the man, at the annotated photograph on the burner phone. "This isn't an authorized operation. She's running this herself. Personal assets." The implications of that landed in the specific order they needed to land. Unauthorized operation meant no institutional oversight, no chain of command to pull her back, no protocol she was constrained by. It meant whatever was planned for 1400 hours was designed to end the problem permanently and then disappear, because an off-book operation left no trail if it succeeded. It also meant Wolf was not operating with military resources. She was operating with whatever network she'd built outside official channels over years of having access to the right information. Private, deniable, and completely dependent on nobody knowing she was here. "She doesn't know we have him," Nora said, nodding at the man on the wall. "Not yet." "How long before she expects contact from him?" Slade looked at the man. "What's your check-in protocol?" The man said nothing. Torres applied a very specific kind of pressure to the arm hold that made the man's jaw tighten. 90 minutes, the man said, flatly, giving nothing except the thing he'd calculated it cost the least to give. 90 minutes before Wolf would know the advance element had gone silent, which gave them a window. Not a comfortable one, not a well-resourced one, but a defined window. "We need to move Harker," Nora said. "Moving a post-thoracic patient 2 hours post-complication," Slade started. "I know what it costs him," she said, "but 1400 hours is a hard timeline, and whoever shows up at 1400 hours is not coming alone and is not coming for a conversation." She looked at Slade directly. "If we're still on this floor at 2 p.m. with a chest drain and a single-exit ICU bay, we're making a choice that we don't have enough people to protect." Slade was quiet for 3 seconds. "What's the safest move option in this building?" She'd already been thinking about it. Sub-basement has a decommissioned monitoring suite from when the hospital expanded the ICU 6 years ago. It's still wired. The monitoring connections are live because nobody bothered to disconnect them when they moved the equipment upstairs. There's a single access point from the main corridor, a secondary access through the imaging wing, and no reason for anyone with a hospital credential to be near it. She paused. It's also not on the public floor plan. The layout was revised when the expansion was completed. The old suite isn't listed on any directory. You know it's wired because I ran a code drill route through it 2 years ago and noticed the panel was still active. She met his gaze. I filed a report to facilities about it. They put it on the list. The same list, she didn't say, as the elevator and the badge reader. The list that existed in this hospital the way certain lists existed everywhere, long, unresolved, and occasionally useful. Torres had the man secured with a zip tie from his jacket. She noted he'd been carrying them and didn't remark on it, and had him against the alcove wall. "I can't leave this position," Torres said. "You don't need to." She turned to Slade. "Renata Dunn is in the family waiting area. She's been in this ICU for 11 years, and she doesn't ask unnecessary questions. I need her back here while we move Harker." She paused. "And I need Dr. Camara to sign off on the transfer, which he won't want to do." "How do we handle Camara?" "I handle Camara," she said. "That part is mine." Slade looked at her for a moment. "You know Wolf is going to have more than one person." "I know. And that sub-basement is only as good as nobody knowing about it." "I know that too. And that we have 2 hours and—" He checked his phone. 24 minutes. "Then we should stop talking about it and start doing it," she said. She was already moving toward Harker's bay. She pushed through the curtain and Harker looked at her and read something in her face immediately. He had the perceptive quality of someone accustomed to reading situations from partial information, and what she was giving him was partial but not subtle. "What's happening?" he said. "We're moving you," she said. "I need you to not fight me on this." "Where?" "Somewhere better than here." She started checking his lines. The chest drain was the critical piece. Everything else was portable. "We have a window and we need to use it." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her. "Wolf," he said. Not a question. "She's in the city," Nora said. Something moved through Harker's face. Not fear. She'd already understood that fear wasn't the thing that moved through this man's face in response to threat. It was something closer to a door closing. A focusing. The particular human reflex of someone who had been waiting for something to arrive and was now recalibrating to the reality of it. "Tack," he said. "He comes with you. He won't transfer easy with strangers." She looked at him. "He's not transferring with strangers." Harker held her gaze. "I need you to trust me," she said. "And I need you to not ask me why you should yet, because we don't have time for that conversation right now." A long beat. His jaw was tight and his color was still not good, and he had a chest drain and a recent surgical repair and was being asked to transfer to an unlisted sub-basement room on the word of a nurse he'd known for approximately 8 hours. "Okay," he said. She went to find Camara. That conversation took 6 minutes and was not pleasant. Camara's position was, medically, not unreasonable. Moving a post-thoracic patient this early created real risks. The drain was just repositioned. The hemodynamics were still normalizing. He said all of this with the controlled precision of a man who understood his clinical argument was solid. She said, "There is a credible threat to this patient's safety in this location that will materialize in approximately 2 hours. The medical risk of transport is real. The security risk of staying is worse, and I need you to make a decision as the responsible physician." He looked at her for a long time. "If he decompensates during transport," he started. "Then I'm there, and I know what to do," she said. "I've been doing this for 4 years and you know my numbers, Dr. Camara. You've seen my patient outcomes. Make a call." Another long beat. "You'll monitor continuously," he said. "Yes." "And you'll halt immediately if his pressure drops below 70 systolic." "Yes." "And someone will explain to me afterward what exactly is happening in my hospital." "Yes," she said. "I promise you that." He signed the transfer order. She was back at the bay in 4 minutes. Renata had returned. Torres had their secured man in the supply alcove. Slade was at the ICU entrance. Tack was in the waiting room, And when Nora came through to get him, he rose from his position immediately, reading the shift in her cadence, reading the change in the room's texture. She put her hand down and he pressed his forehead against her fingers for exactly 1 second. "Okay," she said. "We're going." The transport down the back corridor to the service stairwell took 11 minutes. Harker's pressure held. The chest drain output was minimal. Tack moved alongside the gurney with the focused attention of a working animal in a situation he'd been trained for, and he did not pull and he did not delay. And when they reached the sub-basement door, he sat at her left side and waited. She got the door open. She got Harker situated in the monitoring suite, hooked to the live panel, vitals reading clean on a screen that hadn't been used in 6 years. She got Tack settled at the room's single entrance. She did a full assessment on Harker. Pressure coming up slightly, pain managed, drain functioning. Then she pulled up a chair beside the monitoring panel and looked at the time on her phone. 1 hour and 51 minutes. Slade came through the door and stood in the low light of the sub-basement room and looked at her. "Torres has the contact secured and is holding the ICU floor," he said. "Building security has been told there's a maintenance concern on the 2nd floor and to redirect visitor traffic. They don't know the full situation. Who else knows we're down here?" "Renata Dunn, Kamara, Torres, you and me." He paused. "And whoever Wolf has watching the building exterior." She looked at him. "She has someone watching the building. She's not sloppy," he said, "which means if we moved Harker, she knows we moved Harker. She just doesn't know where." The room was quiet except for the monitoring panel and Harker's breathing. "Then the timeline changes," Nora said. "She won't wait until 1400. She'll move when she loses his location." Slade's phone was already in his hand. It buzzed before he could dial. He looked at the screen, a number she couldn't read from where she was sitting. He answered and listened for 8 seconds and then looked up. "Building security just found a second individual," he said. "Medical records department, ground floor. She had valid credentials for a position that doesn't appear in the current employee roster." He paused. "Her credentials list her supervisor as—" He stopped. "As who?" Nora said. Slade looked at her with an expression that she'd learned to read later as the face he made when a situation moved into territory he'd planned for but had hoped not to reach. "As you," he said. "Her credentials list her immediate supervisor as Nora Voss, ER nursing staff." The room held that. Harker had turned his head from the bed and was looking at her. Tack had risen from his position at the door. Outside the sub-basement, somewhere in the building above them, Petra Wolf's network had just told her something she didn't know before, that whoever was helping Harker had a name, and the name was attached to this building, and the building now had a target that wasn't just the man in the bed. The name sat in the room like something that had been detonated. Nora didn't move. She was aware of Harker watching her from the bed, aware of Tack at the door with his attention sharpened to the particular edge it reached when the humans around him were operating at elevated threat levels, aware of the monitoring panel cycling through its steady readouts behind her. She was aware of all of it, and she was aware of Slade watching her face with the same patient attention he'd been watching her face with since the hallway outside the ICU, waiting for the thing she'd been keeping below the surface to break through. She didn't let it. "The credentials," she said. "How complete are they?" "HR system shows her as a part-time administrative contractor, hired 6 weeks ago. All paperwork correctly filed." Slade was reading from his phone. "Direct supervisor listed as Nora Voss, ER nursing, extension 314. "That's my extension. Yes. I didn't hire anyone." "I know that." He kept his voice even. "The question is who had access to the HR system to build the file, and who had enough information about you specifically to use your name and extension as a credible reference point." She thought about it. Her personnel file, the request made this morning by Slade's channels, which Hospital Legal had been sitting on. But that was this morning. Building a contractor file with her name attached took longer than one morning. It took research. It took someone who had identified her as connected to this situation before last night, before Harker arrived. "How long has the contractor file existed?" she said. Slade checked. "Created 4 weeks ago." 4 weeks ago, she hadn't known David Harker existed. 4 weeks ago, Harker's mission was still in the planning phase, which meant Petra Wolf had identified Harmon Peak Medical Center as a likely destination for a compromised extraction 4 weeks before the extraction happened, and had identified Nora Voss as a hospital employee worth noting. That was not coincidence. That was not reconnaissance. That was foreknowledge of operational outcomes, knowing the mission was going to fail before the mission ran, and preparing accordingly. She knew, Nora said. She planned it, Slade said. The mission didn't fail because she reacted. She constructed the failure. All of it. The intelligence package, the wrong coordinates, the extraction route, Harker ending up here. It was designed. Harker was very still in the bed. She needed him somewhere controllable, he said. His voice was quiet. Not dead in the field. That creates investigation. Dead in a hospital during a medical complication. That's a chart entry. Cause of death. Surgical outcome. The monitoring panel beeped its steady rhythm. The advance element we detained, Nora said. The 1400 hours on the phone. Was the scheduled time for a medical intervention, Slade finished. Someone with clinical access. Someone who could get to a patient in an ICU and introduce a complication that reads as natural. He paused. The contractor in medical records was probably the access point, pulling patient records, identifying nursing rotation schedules, mapping who was assigned to which bay and when. She needed my name on the contractor file, Nora said, because if anything got questioned, the trail pointed to me. She worked through it. A nurse who inexplicably calmed a military working dog, who had unexplained access to classified command sequences, whose personnel file was being requested by federal channels. If Harker died, and someone looked at who had proximity and anomalous background, you'd be the story, Slade said, not Wolf. It was elegant. She hated that it was elegant. She stood up and moved to the corner of the room, putting her back to the wall and her eyes on the door, and she thought with the specific focused quality she'd spent 4 years trying not to need. Wolf was in the city. Her advance element was detained, but Wolf didn't know that yet. They had the window before the 90-minute check-in expired. The second asset, the contractor in medical records, had been found by building security, but Nora didn't know yet if she'd been detained or just identified. If she'd been detained, Wolf's communication chain was broken at 2 points and she was operating blind. If the contractor had been identified but not held, she'd already called in. The woman in medical records, she said. What's building security's status on her? Slade was already on his phone. He asked the question, listened, closed his eyes for exactly 1 second, and lowered the phone. She was asked to wait for verification of her credentials, he said. She waited 6 minutes and then walked out through the main lobby while the security officer was on the phone with HR. So Wolf knew, or would know inside the next few minutes. Then we have maybe 20 minutes before she recalibrates, Nora said. Less, Harker said from the bed. They both looked at him. She doesn't wait once she loses assets, he said. That's her operational pattern. She reads asset loss as exposure, and she moves immediately rather than holds. She'd rather act with incomplete information than wait and lose the window entirely. He paused. If she knows about the contractor being burned, she's already moving. How do you know her pattern? Slade said. Because I've spent 11 months studying every operation she's touched, and the signature is consistent. Harker's voice was flat and precise. She's not the type to cut losses and run either. She's invested too much in this particular outcome. She'll push. Nora looked at the room. The sub-basement monitoring suite had one primary entrance. The door tack was watching, and one secondary access through the imaging wing, which was a connecting corridor that passed through a locked junction. She'd said that to Slade upstairs. Single primary access, secondary through imaging. She'd said it as an advantage. It was also a constraint. 2 entry points to defend with 2 people, one of whom had a chest drain. Slade, she said. Who else can you get here? Actual here in this building in the next 15 minutes? Torres is holding the ICU floor with the detained asset. Torres needs to release the ICU floor. The asset is zip-tied in a supply alcove. He's not going anywhere. She looked at Slade. I need Torres on the imaging wing junction. That secondary access has a lock, but the lock is keyed and I don't have the key, which means someone who knows that corridor could get through it faster than I could get to it. Slade sent the text while she was still talking. Then, anyone else in this building who I can trust? She thought about it with the particular discomfort of thinking about who you trusted in a building full of people you knew well, and none of whom had signed up for this. Renata was upstairs. Kamara was somewhere in the hospital. She thought about Alicia Park, who had steady hands and a specific kind of unflappable quality that Nora had noticed over 2 years of working alongside her. And then she put that thought away because Alicia Park was a resident, and this was not a residency situation. Just Torres, she said. Then we have 3 people. And a dog, Harker said. Nobody acknowledged that, but nobody dismissed it either. What? The next 14 minutes were the specific kind of quiet that was worse than noise. Nora monitored Harker's vitals on the panel. His pressure was holding at 88/58, which was lower than she wanted but stable in direction. She adjusted the drain connection and checked the output and made him drink 4 ounces of water from the bottle Renata had sent down with the transfer kit, which he did without complaining, which told her his pain was occupying most of his available complaining capacity. Torres arrived through the primary entrance at minute 9, slightly winded from the stairs. ICU asset is secured, Torres said. I told the floor supervisor there's a biohazard protocol in effect for that supply alcove, which will keep anyone from opening it for at least 2 hours. He looked around the sub-basement room. Nice. The junction door in the imaging wing, Nora said. It's a keyed lock, Falcon commercial grade. The key is held at the facilities desk on the ground floor. I don't need the key, Torres said. He held up a small case. I need 3 minutes and no interruptions. She didn't ask about the case. The junction is 60 feet down the imaging corridor, left turn off the main basement passage, green door. There's a cart storage bay across from it that has a sightline on the door. Torres nodded and went. She turned back to the panel. Harker was watching her with his head turned on the pillow and the specific quality of attention that she'd been on the receiving end of since the ICU. The look of someone who had questions that the present situation kept interrupting. You're going to want to ask me things, she said. I'm going to want to ask you a lot of things, he agreed. After, he said, not a concession. On agreement, there was a difference. Slade was at the primary entrance with his back to the wall beside the door frame. He'd stopped pretending to check his phone and had the settled posture of someone who'd moved into a different operational mode. Less investigation, more the other thing. The monitoring panel showed 11:47. At 11:51, Tack stood up. He didn't make a sound. He rose from his position, body low, head oriented toward the primary door, and the shift in him was the kind of signal that didn't need interpretation. Slade moved. Nora stayed at the panel. Leaving Harker's monitoring unattended wasn't an option. And she watched Slade flatten against the wall beside the door frame, and she watched the door handle. It didn't move. The sound, when it came, was from the imaging wing side. A distant mechanical sound, a lock disengaging, and then nothing. She picked up her phone and texted Torres. Sound from junction. Status. 11 seconds. Then, doors open. I'm at the cart bay. 2 individuals. Stopped at junction, haven't moved into corridor. 2. So not Wolf yet. Wolf wouldn't be in the first entry. She'd send assets first, confirm the situation, then move. She texted back. Hold position. Do not engage until I say. She looked at Slade. He'd read it over her shoulder. 2 in the imaging wing, she said, holding at the junction. They're waiting for a signal from the advance element, he said. The one upstairs. When they don't get it, they'll assume detention and go to contingency, she finished, which is probably a forced entry on a timer. She thought about it. They'll give it 2 minutes, maybe 3. And if they come through that junction door, Torres is one person in a cart bay. I know. So tell me what you're thinking, Slade said, because you have an expression that means you're thinking something. She was thinking about the hospital layout. The sub-basement was below the main basement, which was where the imaging wing junction was. The only connection between the 2 levels was the primary stairwell and the service elevator that hadn't worked in 3 weeks, which meant the 2 individuals in the imaging wing could get to the junction door, but couldn't get to the sub-basement monitoring suite without going through the primary stairwell, which brought them to the primary entrance, which was where Slade was. Unless they knew about the connecting passage between the imaging wing and the main basement corridor, which was not on any public floor plan, which was not on the revised hospital layout that had been distributed after the ICU expansion. It was, however, on the original building schematic, which was a matter of public record if you knew to look for it. Slade, she said, did Wolf have access to the original building plans for this hospital? He looked at her. HR filed the contractor application 6 weeks ago, she said. Building plans are public record through the city permit office, which means someone doing advance work on this facility would have pulled them. She held his gaze. The original schematic shows a connecting passage from the imaging wing subfloor directly to the monitoring suite corridor. It was sealed during the renovation, but sealed means drywall, not concrete. Slade looked at the east wall of the room. She looked at it too. It was a standard hospital interior wall, metal stud frame, drywall over insulation, painted the same institutional beige as everything else in the building. From the outside, in the imaging wing subfloor, it would look like the end of a corridor. From this side, it looked like a wall. It had been a door. "How thick is that wall?" Slade said. "Standard interior. 3.5 inches of framing plus drywall on both sides." She was already moving, pulling the supply shelving unit away from the east wall. It was on wheels, which she'd noted when they set up the room, and it moved with effort, but it moved. Behind it, the wall was uninterrupted beige. If they have a schematic, they know this wall exists. If they have the right tools, they came prepared, Slade said, and he was already moving to her position, and she understood that they were now racing a clock that had just become a different clock. She looked at Harker. "I need you to stay on the panel," she said. "If your pressure drops below 70, you call out." "Nora," he said. It was the first time he'd used her first name, and it landed differently than she expected. "I know," she said. "Stay on the panel." She turned to Slade. "The wall's load-bearing on the framing side. If they come through it, they're coming through the center where the studs are spaced. They won't have more than a 16-inch opening on the first pass." She looked at the room. "Which means they come through one at a time." "And we're on the other side of the opening when they do," Slade said. "And Tack is here," she said. They looked at the dog. Tack had turned away from the primary door and was oriented toward the east wall. His posture was the lowest she'd seen it, the full combat-ready position that working Malinois took when they'd identified a specific directional threat. She hadn't commanded it. He'd read the room. From the east wall, she heard it. A faint, specific sound. Not knocking, not testing. The sound of a tool making first contact with drywall. She put her hand on Tack's collar. He didn't resist. She positioned him to her left side and looked at Slade, who had moved to the right of the projected opening, back against the wall, and was ready in the way people were ready when they'd spent years being ready. The sound from the wall got louder. It took 4 minutes, which felt like 20. The drywall came through in sections. They were using something with a flat blade, working methodically rather than quickly, which told her they'd done this kind of thing before and knew that fast was loud and loud was a liability. A rectangular opening appeared in the beige wall, framed by raw stud framing, 18 inches wide and about 5 feet tall when they finished. The first person through it led with a flashlight, which was the wrong decision in a lit room. He had approximately 1 second to register that the room was occupied before Slade was on him, and it was efficient in the way that things were efficient when one person was ready and one person was not. The flashlight hit the floor. Tack moved to the opening. Not through it, but positioned at it, blocking, the sound from his chest filling the space. The second person on the other side of the wall stopped. "Call it off," she said. Silence from the opening. "There is a 90-pound Belgian Malinois at this entry point," she said. "He is not going to negotiate. Call your second person off, or I release him." 4 seconds. "Step back," a voice said from the opening. Male, controlled, giving ground. She heard the footsteps recede. Slade had the first man secured. Torres had come through the primary door at the sound of the breach. She heard him at her back, covering the room. 2 assets detained. Wolf's forward element, gone. That left Wolf. She picked up her phone and sent a text to the number Slade had given her for the federal contact coordinating the investigation. She wrote, "Sub-basement, Harmon Peak. We have 2 of Wolf's assets detained. Wolf is in the city, off-book operation. Need federal presence at this building immediately." She paused and then added, "I have testimony. Primary witness, original ambush 4.5 years ago. I'm prepared to give a full recorded statement." She stared at the message for 2 seconds and hit send. Then she sat down in the chair by the monitoring panel and looked at Harker's vitals. Pressure at 91/60, heart rate 104. Not good, not terrible. She checked the drain. Output holding. "You sent something," Harker said. "Yes." "The testimony," he said. That was, yes, she said again. He was quiet for a moment. It's going to open everything up, he said. Not an objection, a statement. I know. Your name, the real one. She looked at the monitoring panel for a long moment. 4 years of building Nora Voss, brick by brick, in a city where nobody knew her. 4 years of small and specific and hers. She thought about it with the full weight of what it was, and she didn't minimize that weight, because it deserved its full weight. Yes, she said. Parker looked at her in a way that was careful and quiet, and had something in it she didn't examine closely because the timing was wrong for examining things closely. Slade was on his phone in the corner, coordinating with the federal contact, and Torres was running a check of the imaging wing corridor to ensure it was clear, and the two detained men were zip-tied against the wall under Tack's watchful and thoroughly unambiguous supervision. At 12:23, Slade's phone buzzed. He looked at it, then he looked at Nora. Federal response is 18 minutes out, he said. Multiple units. The contact moved the moment they got your text. The testimony offer. He paused. It was apparently a significant development. Wolf, she said. Last tracked location was a parking structure 2 blocks east of the hospital. He paused. She went off surveillance 11 minutes ago. 11 minutes. She thought about the building, about all the ways in and out of it, about the service entrances and the delivery docks and the staff parking exits. She thought about a woman who had been running misdirection operations for years, who had built contractor files and corrupted mission packages and sent men through drywall walls, going off surveillance in a parking structure 2 blocks away. She thought about what someone like that did when they realized their operation had collapsed. They didn't run. Not immediately. Not someone like Wolf. They went for the one thing that could still salvage the situation. The testimony offer, she said slowly. When the federal contact received it, how fast did that communication move? Slade looked at her. Federal communications are logged through a central relay, he said carefully. A relay that an embedded intelligence officer with Wolf's clearance level could access. A silence. She'd know within minutes, Slade said. She'd know there was a witness. She'd know the testimony would name her. She'd know the federal response was incoming. Nora stood up. She's not running. She's coming here. One last attempt to eliminate the witness before the federal units arrive. The witness being you, Torres said from the doorway. The witness being me. She looked at the room. And she doesn't need to get to Harker anymore. She needs to get to me. The monitoring panel beeped. Tack turned from the detained men toward the primary door. From the corridor outside the sub-basement, from the direction of the primary stairwell, she heard a single set of footsteps. Measured, unhurried, the footsteps of someone who knew exactly where they were going and had decided to stop performing anything other than what they were. Slade moved to the door frame. Don't, Nora said. He looked at her. Let her come in, she said. A pause. What? Torres started. She came here herself, Nora said. No assets, no approach team, just her, walking in. That means she's not here to conduct an operation. She's here because the operation is over and she knows it, and she came anyway. She met Slade's eyes. Which means she either has something we don't know about, or she's making a decision that isn't tactical. That's not a reason to let her through the door, Slade said. It is if we want her talking and not running, Nora said. Federal units are 17 minutes out. If she walks in here, she's in a room with 2 federal agents, 2 detained assets, and a witness who just offered to give a recorded statement. She has nowhere to go. She paused. Let her calculate that herself. 3 seconds. Slade stepped back from the doorframe. The footsteps reached the sub-basement door. The door opened. Petra Wolf was 51 years old and had the kind of presence that came from years of inhabiting authority at levels where authority was the primary currency. She was medium height, dark-haired, going gray at the temples in a way she hadn't bothered to address, wearing civilian clothes that were well cut and practical. Her eyes were dark and moved through the room in the fast, systematic sweep of someone conducting an assessment, and the assessment took about 4 seconds and told her everything the room contained. She looked at the detained men. She looked at Torres. She looked at Slade. She looked at Harker in the bed. Then she looked at Nora. Something moved in her face. Not surprise. She was past the stage of being surprised. It was something older and heavier than surprise. Recognition. Vasquez, she said. The name in Wolf's voice was a different thing than it had been in Slade's. Slade had said it like a key being tested in a lock. Wolf said it like a debt being named. "Major," Nora said, "you look different." 4 years will do that. Wolf was still in the doorway. She hadn't moved into the room and she hadn't retreated. She was standing at the threshold in a way that was, Nora thought, genuinely undecided, which was the first genuinely human thing she'd seen from this woman who existed until now only as the shape her actions had left behind. "You should have stayed dead," Wolf said. "I know," Nora said. "You built the operation assuming I had." Wolf's gaze moved to Harker. The documents were destroyed. "The documents were one thread," Harker said from the bed. "You spent 11 months thinking they were the only thread." "And in the meantime," Slade said from his position against the wall, "we built another case. Communications analysis, pattern mapping, 3 operational signatures that connect to you across 6 years. The documents would have accelerated prosecution. They weren't the prosecution." Wolf looked at him. "The federal units will be here in—" Slade checked his phone. 14 minutes. You have the option of being in this room when they arrive, or being in the building somewhere when they arrive, and the distinction matters to how the next several years of your life look." He paused. "But you already know you're not leaving the building." A silence that had the particular texture of a room where the counting was happening, where the weight was being measured. Wolf looked back at Nora. "I had reasons," she said. "Not an apology. Not quite a justification. The statement of someone who had spent years carrying something and was not sure anymore what it weighed." "I know you did," Nora said. "You'll get to explain them." "They won't be enough." "Probably not." Another silence. Wolf stepped into the room. She walked past Slade, past Torres, past the 2 detained men who watched her with the specific resignation of assets who understood the operation was over. She walked to the far wall and stood with her back to it and her hands visible at her sides. She didn't say anything else. Tak watched her with his low, patient attention and did not advance and did not retreat. Nora turned to the monitoring panel. Harker's pressure was 93/61, trending up by small increments, each one earned. She noted it. She checked the drain. From the corner of the room, Wolf's voice came, quiet and without inflection. "Your team, Vasquez, the 3 who died that night. Their names were Donovan, Park, and Reyes." Nora didn't turn around. "I know their names," she said. "I'm not sure it matters to you, but I knew them too." Nora was quiet for a moment. Her hands were on the monitoring panel, steady, the way they were always steady. "It doesn't change anything," she said. "No," Wolf said. "It doesn't." The monitoring panel beeped its rhythm. Harker breathed. The detained men were silent. Torres held his position. Slade was on his phone, coordinating the federal arrival, and somewhere above them the hospital continued its ordinary work, the fractured and the sick and the frightened being met by people who showed up and tried. At 12:31, Slade looked up from his phone. "They're in the building," he said. And from outside the sub-basement door, from the direction of the primary stairwell, came the controlled sound of multiple sets of feet descending, professional pace, the sound of people arriving with the specific weight of authority that had been earned rather than assumed. Nora looked at the monitoring panel one more time. Then she turned around to face the door. On the far wall, Petra Wolf reached into her jacket pocket. Torres was up immediately, hand on his weapon. Wolf produced a phone. She looked at it for a moment, looked at it with the particular quality of someone saying goodbye to something, and held it out toward Slade. "Everything's on here," she said. "Full records. Every operation. Every name in the network." She paused. "I kept records because I always kept records. Old habit." Her voice was flat. "Use them." Slade crossed the room and took the phone. He looked at it. Then he looked at her. "Why?" he said. Wolf looked at Nora. "Because she's standing in this room," she said. "And she should have been standing in rooms for the last 4 years, and she wasn't, and that's a debt that doesn't balance." She paused. "It doesn't balance, but it's a start." The door opened. The federal units came through. The room filled with the specific organized presence of people with authority and purpose and documentation, and Nora stood at the monitoring panel with her hands at her sides and let them fill the room around her. Harker's voice came from the bed, quiet enough that only she could hear it. "Hey." She looked at him. "You okay?" She thought about it for a real second. Not the automatic answer, the real one. "Ask me in an hour," she said. He looked at her with something in his eyes that was patient and tired and had room in it for an hour. Then a federal agent in a dark jacket was at her elbow, badge out, professional voice asking for Nora Voss, and from across the room Slade looked at her with a question in his expression, and she understood the question, and she understood that answering it correctly meant answering it with the right name. She straightened. "I'm Lieutenant Sarah Vasquez," she said, "Air Force, Special Operations Rescue, and I'm ready to give my statement." The agent looked at her, looked at Slade. Slade nodded. The agent turned back and said, "We're going to need a recording setup and a separate room." "Take the time you need," Slade said. Then, to Nora, to Sarah, quietly. "The statement is going to go up the chain fast. Once it does, Wolf's network starts falling in sequence. These things usually take— I know how long they take," she said. A pause. "Right," he said. Not dismissive, acknowledging something. She looked at Harker one more time. He was watching her with the steady, careful attention he'd been watching her with since she first walked into his bay, the look that had asked a question he hadn't been able to phrase correctly yet. From the doorway, Torres spoke. "Slade," he said. "The phone Wolf handed over. The record's on it." He paused. "There's a file flagged urgent. It's not an operations file." Slade looked at him. "What is it?" Torres looked at Nora. "It's a personnel file," he said. "Original. Pre-incident. From 4.5 years ago." He paused. "It lists 2 additional members of Vasquez's unit who were on the mission roster that night." He looked at Nora steadily. "The official report listed 3 KIA and 1 missing. The official report was wrong." The room was very quiet. "How wrong?" Slade said. "The official count was 2 KIA, Torres said. "Not 3. Donovan and Park. Reyes—" He stopped. "Reyes was listed as KIA in the official report. Reyes is not in Wolf's personnel records as deceased. Reyes is in Wolf's records as—" He stopped again. "As a controlled asset. Active." The word active landed in the room with the weight of everything it implied. Nora felt the floor shift under her in a way that was entirely internal and entirely real. Marcus Reyes, her team, the man she'd spent 4.5 years grieving alongside the others, whose name she carried in the specific private way you carried the names of people who died beside you. Not dead, controlled. "For how long?" said the question that was already building behind her sternum. "For how long and doing what and where?" "Where?" she said. Her voice came out even. She made it even. Torres looked at the phone in his gloved hand. "Current location is listed as Caldwell, Colorado," he said. "He's been here for 3 weeks." 3 weeks. She stood in the sub-basement room with federal agents moving around her and the monitoring panel cycling behind her, and the name Marcus Reyes doing something to the inside of her chest that she didn't have immediate language for, and she thought, 3 weeks. He'd been in this city for 3 weeks. She'd been working 12-hour shifts and buying groceries and taking the stairs to her 4th-floor apartment, and Marcus Reyes, who she had grieved, who she had carried, whose name sat in the permanent ledger of people she'd lost on that mountain in the wrong coordinates dark, had been inside the same city limits. Controlled asset, active. She understood what that meant operationally. She'd been in the world long enough to know what it looked like when someone didn't die so much as get redirected, captured, turned, managed, coerced by whatever Wolf had used as leverage, which could have been anything from a manufactured criminal record to a family member to simple survival, because survival was sometimes enough. She understood it clinically. Understanding it clinically did not make it sit any easier. "Where in the city?" she said. Torres was still looking at the phone. "Address in the file is a residential property, East Side, registered to a shell company." He looked up. "The file has a handler notation. Someone was managing his contact schedule. Check-ins every 72 hours. Last check-in? 41 hours ago, which meant he was due in 31 hours, which meant he didn't know yet that the operation had collapsed, that Wolf was in federal custody in this room, that the network he'd been threaded into was already beginning to unravel at every seam. She looked at Wolf. Wolf was standing against the far wall with 2 federal agents at her sides and her hands in front of her, and her face holding the particular stillness of someone who has made a decision and arrived at the specific quiet on the other side of it. She met Nora's gaze without flinching. "He didn't want this," Wolf said. "For what it's worth. He negotiated for it. What I could give him had limits." "What did you give him?" "His sister," Wolf said. "She was in a situation. I had the ability to resolve it. He understood the cost." The way she said it, not cruel, not proud, just factual, was in some ways worse than cruelty would have been. It was the voice of someone who'd been operating in a world where people were resources for so long that the transaction had stopped feeling like one. "I want to speak with him before any federal approach," Nora said. She was looking at Wolf, but she said it to Slade. Slade looked at the lead federal agent, a woman in her 40s named Decker, who had come through the door with the contained authority of someone who ran field operations and had opinions about civilians making requests in the middle of them. "That's not standard," Decker said. "He was my teammate," Nora said. "He thinks I'm dead. If federal agents show up at that address without any prior contact, you're going to get one of two outcomes. Either he runs because he's been conditioned to run, or he doesn't open the door at all." She held Decker's gaze steadily. "I can make contact by phone first. Give him something to hold on to before your people arrive. It will be faster and cleaner." Decker looked at Slade. "She's right about the approach problem," Slade said. "Assets in long-term control situations are managed to distrust official contact. If he's been operating under Wolf's handler protocol for 4 years, federal credentials at his door could trigger a contingency response." A pause. "Supervised call," Decker said. "Recorded. You don't give him operational details. You don't warn him to run. You don't discuss the network. You establish contact and request voluntary cooperation. That's the scope." "That's all I need," Nora said. They set it up in 4 minutes. A recorded line, her phone, Torres in the room as witness. Slade had the number from Wolf's file. She looked at it for a moment before she dialed. A cell number. No name attached in the file, just an asset designation that reduced Marcus Reyes to a string of letters and numbers that the person who'd given him that designation was now standing 15 feet away in federal custody. She dialed. It rang 3 times. Then, "Yeah." Cautious, the voice of someone who didn't recognize the incoming number and had learned not to assume that unknown numbers were benign. She knew the voice immediately and completely, the way you knew voices that had been present in the worst moments of your life. Her body recognized it before her mind caught up. "Marcus," she said. A silence that lasted long enough that she thought he'd ended the call. Then, "That's not—" His voice had changed. Something had broken open in it. "That is not possible." "I know," she said. "I know it's not. I'm going to need you to stay on the line." Another silence. She could hear him breathing, rapid, then deliberately slowed. She recognized the technique, the same one she used, the one they'd learned in the same program from the same instructors. "Sarah." Not a question, just her name, said the way you said something you'd stopped letting yourself think about because thinking about it was a particular kind of damage. "Yeah," she said. "How long?" he said. 4 years. "You've been—" "Caldwell," she said. "Harmon Peak Medical Center. 4 years." Another silence, and in it she heard 4 years of distance trying to collapse into a phone call, and she knew it wouldn't collapse cleanly. These things never did. There would be a long and difficult reckoning on the other side of today, conversations that would take hours and leave both of them raw. But that was for later. Right now she needed him present. "The operation is over, Marcus," she said. "Wolf is in federal custody. Her network is compromised. Whatever she told you would happen if you stepped outside the arrangement, it's done. The leverage is gone." A long pause. "My sister. We'll address it," she said. "That's a promise I'm making to you right now. Whatever situation she was in, whatever Wolf used, we'll address it. You have my word." She heard him exhale, a long, complicated breath that carried things in it she'd have to understand slowly. "There are federal agents who need to speak with you," she said. "They're going to come to your location. I need you to open the door." "Are you going to be there?" She looked at Decker. Decker considered for 2 seconds, then nodded. "Yes," she said. "Well." They left Torres with the detained assets and Slade coordinating the federal transfer of Wolf and her network records. And Decker took a 3-vehicle team to the East Side address. and Nora sat in the second vehicle and looked out the window at Caldwell moving past. Her city, the one she'd chosen because it asked nothing of her, the one that had 4 years of her grocery receipts and parking tickets and late shifts embedded in it like sediment. She thought about what it meant to have built a life in the wrong name and whether the life was less real for that, and she decided, looking at the morning streets, that it wasn't. Nora Voss had been careful and competent, and had caught medication errors and held the hands of frightened people and learned which coffee machine worked. That had happened. It was real. The name was a construction, but the 4 years were not. She was going to have to figure out what came after, and that was going to be its own kind of hard. But it was the hard that came after something was resolved, rather than the hard that came from something being suspended. And she knew from experience that those two types of hard felt different in the body. The address was a small house on a residential street that looked like every other house on the block, maintained without being notable, curtains drawn on the front windows, a car in the driveway that was practical and inconspicuous. Decker's team took position at the perimeter with the professional low visibility of people who'd done this many times, and Nora walked up the front path to the door. She knocked. The door opened after 7 seconds. Marcus Reyes was 34 years old and had the look of someone who'd been carrying a specific weight for a long time. Not broken, because the people they'd trained alongside didn't break easily, but compressed, like a spring that had been held down past its natural tension point. He was thinner than she remembered. He looked at her face for a long moment with eyes that were doing the complicated work of revising a fixed understanding of the world. "You look terrible," he said. "I've been up since yesterday," she said. "Me too." He stepped back from the door. "Come in." She went in. "Gad." The debrief at the federal field office took 11 hours across 2 days. She gave her full statement, not the supervised call version, not the abbreviated version, the complete account, from the night of the ambush through 4 years of constructed identity. To the night David Harker arrived in her ER with a chest wound and a Belgian Malinois who remembered something the paperwork said shouldn't exist. She gave it to Decker and to 2 other federal investigators, and to a woman from the Air Force JAG office who took notes with the focused attention of someone who understood that the notes she was taking had implications that ran in several directions at once. It was not a clean process. There were questions she answered 3 times in slightly different framings. Questions designed to test consistency rather than gather new information, and she answered them consistently because the truth was consistent in the way that constructed stories weren't. There were moments when the investigators pushed on details she hadn't thought about in years, and she had to let herself go back to the mountain and the wrong coordinates and the ambush and the extraction she'd done alone, bleeding and oriented by compass in the dark. And that going back cost her something she felt in the following nights, but that she paid because it was owed. Marcus's debrief ran parallel. They weren't allowed to compare notes during the process, which was correct procedure and which she respected even though it was difficult. She knew enough from her own debrief to understand that his account corroborated hers at every point that overlapped, and that the picture they assembled together with the records from Wolf's phone created something the investigators described, with professional understatement, as a comprehensive evidentiary package. The word comprehensive was doing a lot of work in that sentence. She understood it to mean that what they'd built was enough, that it wouldn't fall apart in a proceeding, that after 4.5 years of the wrong coordinates being listed in a file somewhere as bad intelligence, and the 3 names on her team being listed as KIA, and her own name being listed as KIA, and the officer who'd constructed all of it, continuing to certify mission packages and manage assets and attend military functions. After all of that, there was now enough. On the morning of the 3rd day, Decker came into the debrief room and sat down and said, "Major Petra Wolf has been charged with 2 counts of murder in the 1st degree, 14 counts of conspiracy, 6 counts of obstruction, and violations of federal statutes covering the unauthorized use of intelligence resources and the coercion of a military asset. Her network records have identified 9 additional individuals across 3 agencies who are currently being processed." She paused. "The charges carry mandatory federal sentencing. Her legal team has already indicated she intends to cooperate further in exchange for consideration. The cooperation will not affect the primary charges." "The cooperation is the phone she handed over," Nora said. "Among other things. She's been talking." Decker's expression was professionally neutral. She has a great deal to say. Nora looked at the table for a moment. She thought about Wolf in the sub-basement, standing against the wall with her hands visible, handing the phone to Slade. The debt that doesn't balance. It doesn't balance, but it's a start. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't the kind of story where forgiveness was the tidy resolution, because the three people on that mountain didn't get to be in this room, and tidy resolutions were for situations that hadn't cost that much. But there was something in the accounting, something that moved. The Air Force is conducting a parallel review of the mission records, Decker continued. Lieutenant Donovan and Specialist Park will be posthumously recognized. The KIA classifications will be formally corrected with accompanying documentation. She paused. Your own status and record are being reviewed by a joint panel. The Air Force JAG office anticipates a complete formal reinstatement of record, which means your service history, your rank, your commendations, all of it restored to official status. Nora was quiet. Lieutenant Vasquez, Decker said, do you understand what that means practically? It means I exist again, she said. Decker nodded. It means you exist again. Parker was moved from the sub-basement back to a standard ICU room on the day of the federal arrests, once the building was secured and the threat was assessed as resolved. He spent 4 more days at Harmon Peak before Thoracic cleared him for transfer to a military medical facility in Denver for the remainder of his recovery. She went to see him the afternoon before the transfer. He was sitting up in bed, which was progress, and the drain had been removed that morning, which was more progress, and he had the particular aliveness of someone whose body was making itself known in a way that was no longer immediately dangerous. TAC was allowed back in the room by that point. Renata had advocated for it with the hospital administration in the specific way Renata advocated for things, which was to say she'd informed them of her position and waited for them to agree. And the dog was in his position at the foot of the bed, monitoring the room with the same thorough attention he'd brought to every room he'd occupied in the past week. She pulled up the chair and sat. They tell me you're going to Denver tomorrow, she said. They tell me the same thing. He looked at her. He'd had 4 days of recovery and debrief of his own, and the gray had mostly left his face, and he looked more like what she suspected he normally looked like, which was direct and considered and tired in the specific way of people who'd been doing difficult things for a long time and had made a specific peace with that. How's the pain? She said. 3, he said. Maybe 4 when I stand up too fast. Use the spirometer. I've been using the spirometer. Every 2 hours? Approximately every 2 hours. That's not the same thing. The corner of his mouth moved. No, he said. It's not. She looked at Tack, who had turned his head toward her with the unhurried attention he gave things he'd decided to trust. She thought about the night he'd pressed his forehead against her hand in the trauma bay, that 3-second wait of him, and what it had cost her not to let herself feel the full weight of it in the moment. Reyes, Harker said. He's cooperating fully, she said. His sister's situation is being addressed. There was a civil matter that Wolf had managed to complicate. The JAG office has people on it. She paused. He's going to have a long road. It's not going to be simple for him. No, Harker said. But he's got someone on the other side of it who knows what the road looks like. She looked at him. You, he said simply. She didn't say anything, because there wasn't an argument to make, and she wasn't going to make one for the sake of deflecting something true. What happens to you now? He said. It was the question she'd been sitting with for 3 days, in the margins of depositions, and in the hotel room the federal office had arranged, and in the taxi back to her apartment on Crestline Avenue, where her mail had piled up, and her coffee maker was still set to 5:50 a.m., and her life was sitting in every corner of every room exactly as she'd left it. The formal reinstatement is going through, she said, which means technically I have options that didn't exist a week ago. Technically, he said, the Air Force will offer reinstatement to active duty. The JAG office mentioned it. The option exists. Are you going to take it? She thought about it, not performing the thought, actually doing it, sitting with the weight of what it would mean to put the uniform back on, to step back into that world with its structure and its purpose and its costs, all the costs she knew from experience and all the ones she'd learned from the people who hadn't come back. I don't know yet, she said. I think there are things I need to figure out first that I haven't been able to figure out while I was also figuring out how to exist. She paused. 4 years of not being yourself takes something, not the bad way necessarily. You learn things about yourself that you might not have learned otherwise. But there's she searched for the word, a calibration that needs to happen between who I was and who I became and who those two people are together. He nodded. It wasn't dismissive or impatient. It was the nod of someone who understood long processes. What I know, she said, is that I'm going back to the ER. He looked at her. Not forever, maybe, she said, but for now. There's a 14-year-old with asthma that I admitted the night you came in, who I haven't been able to follow up on because of everything. And there are 3 other patients whose charts I've been thinking about. And Alicia Park is a resident with excellent instincts who would benefit from someone spending actual time with her instead of just proximity. She looked at her hands. The work is real. It was real before and it's real now. I don't think the name I was doing it under changes what it was. Harker was quiet for a moment. Then, no, he said, it doesn't. She stood up. She had a debrief session in 2 hours and a meeting with the hospital administrator after that. There were conversations to have about personnel records and legal status, and the practical question of whether Nora Voss could continue to exist as a professional identity while Sarah Vasquez was reinstated to record, which was a question she'd been told the JAG office had explored precedents for, and which she suspected was going to require more paperwork than anything else in her life combined. She looked at Harker. Thank you, she said. He looked surprised, which was the first time she'd seen him look surprised. For what? For sending the authentication code to a name that didn't exist, she said. You didn't know if I was real. You didn't know if I was the person you thought I might be. You sent it anyway. I sent it to 4 people, he said. I didn't know which ones would respond. You sent it to a KIA notation, she said. That's not the same as sending it to the other 3. He held her gaze. I had a theory, he said. What theory? That someone who goes to the trouble of becoming a different person completely, new name, new city, new career, probably has a reason worth understanding, he said. And that if the reason was what I thought it might be, then the code was the right thing to send. He paused. I was right. You were right, she said. She put her hand down to Tack, who pressed into it with the same gravity he always brought to that gesture. She scratched behind his ear, the working side, the command side, and he tolerated it with the dignity of an animal who considered dignity important and affection acceptable in measured doses. She straightened. Take care of him, she told Tack. Tack looked at her with his dark, total attention. She walked out. The formal proceedings took 3 months. That was the actual timeline, which nobody who hadn't sat through federal investigations would believe, and everyone who had would consider remarkably fast. 3 months of depositions and evidence reviews and JAG panel sessions, and a federal prosecution process that moved with the specific momentum of a case where the evidence was comprehensive and the institutional will to pursue it was genuine. Decker turned out to be the kind of investigator who did not lose threads. She followed each name on Wolf's network records to its conclusion. 9 additional prosecutions, 3 agencies restructured, 2 program reviews ordered by congressional oversight that would take years to complete, but that had been initiated, which was not nothing. Petra Wolf pled to the primary charges on the 51st day of proceedings. Her cooperation had reduced the supplementary count, not the core. She was sentenced to federal prison with a minimum term that the judge specified with the particular clarity of a judicial statement designed to be unambiguous about its intent. The sentencing was public record. Nora read the filing in her apartment on Crestline Avenue at 6 in the morning with her coffee and didn't feel what she'd expected to feel, which wasn't relief exactly and wasn't satisfaction exactly, but was something quieter. The specific sensation of a door closing that had been open for 4.5 years, the draft finally stopping. Donovan and Park were posthumously recognized in a ceremony at Harmon Peak Air Force Base that she attended in uniform for the first time in 4 years. The uniform felt like something she'd grown back into rather than something put on. Not comfortable immediately, not a perfect fit, but hers in the way things were yours when they'd cost you something real. She stood in the front row and listened to their names said correctly in front of people who understood what those names meant, and she let herself feel the full weight of it without managing it for once. And the weight was enormous and entirely appropriate, and she stood under it without flinching because that was what the moment required, and she was capable of what moments required. Marcus Reyes stood beside her. He was still in the process of his own long reckoning, with what he'd done under Wolf's direction, with the years he'd lost, with the sister who was now free of the situation that had been used to leverage him, but who had her own damage from it and her own road. He was not okay. He was also not alone. And those two things were both true at the same time, which was how most of the real things in life were. She didn't fix it for him. She couldn't. What she could do was be someone who'd been through the specific dark of that experience and come out the other side still standing and let him see that and show up when he called. Some things you couldn't accelerate. You could only make the company available. Slade called her 2 weeks after the sentencing with a question that wasn't phrased as a question. "There's a role," he said, "joint program. Draws on personnel with specific cross-qualified backgrounds, clinical, operational, the kind of combination that's rare enough that when it exists, someone in an office somewhere notices." He paused. "It's not active duty in the traditional sense. It's more consultative," she said. "Part-time consultative," he said, "which would allow for other employment." She looked out the window of her apartment at the Caldwell skyline, going orange in the evening light, the particular flat Colorado sunset that spread itself across everything without apology. "Send me the materials," she said. "Already sent," he said. 20 minutes ago." "You were that sure?" "I was that hopeful," he said. "There's a difference." She thought about that after she hung up. The distinction between sure and hopeful, and what it meant that someone who operated in the world Slade operated in had maintained the capacity to differentiate between the two. Some people came out of that world with everything flattened into probability assessments. Some of them kept something. She went back to the ER. Not because it was the only thing available to her, it wasn't, not anymore, but because she'd meant what she'd said to Harker. The work was real, and real work had a value that didn't disappear when your circumstances changed. She walked the same corridors she'd walked for 4 years, and the staff treated her with the specific combination of familiar and uncertain that came from knowing someone had a different past than the one they'd presented and not being sure how to adjust for that. Dr. Holt treated her with careful professional courtesy that was, she suspected, going to be the permanent tenor of their working relationship, and she was fine with that. Alicia Park asked her, directly and without preamble, whether she'd be willing to work with her on trauma assessment skills, and she said yes, and meant it. Renata Dunn said nothing about any of it, and simply resumed operating as though they'd always understood each other, which was accurate. Deborah Finch stopped her in the locker room on her first day back and said, "I told you I would need you to explain it eventually." "I know, Nora," Sarah said. "That's a lot," Deborah said. "It is." Deborah looked at her for a moment. "Are you okay?" She thought about the real answer, the full weight version. "Getting there," she said. Deborah nodded in the way of someone who understood that getting there was not the same as being there, and also understood that getting there was the only path available and was therefore not a diminished answer. "The asthma kid from the night all this started," Deborah said. "Bay 7. He came back yesterday for a follow-up. He asked about you." She hadn't known that. "How is he?" "Better," Deborah said. "His mother said whatever you did that night bought them enough time to get his medication protocol properly adjusted. He's been stable for 2 weeks." She paused. "He's 14. He seemed embarrassed to ask, but he asked." She stood in the locker room with her badge in her hand, her new badge, updated, with a different name on it that was both names at once. The hyphenated solution, the hospital administration, and the JAG office had eventually arrived at after the paperwork she'd predicted. Voss Vasquez. Ungainly. True. She thought about a 14-year-old who'd been scared in Bay 7 and was now stable, and she thought about what it meant to do work that was real, and she thought about the distance between where she'd been 4.5 years ago and where she was now, and how the distance didn't resolve into a lesson so much as it resolved into a practice. The ongoing, imperfect daily choice to show up and be useful and stay present even when presence was the harder thing to sustain. She thought about what it cost to disappear and what it cost to come back, and how neither one was free, and how the coming back, for all its cost, was the one she'd choose again. She clipped the badge to her scrubs. She walked out to the floor. Outside in the bay, an ambulance was already pulling in, the radio crackling with incoming information, a voice running vitals, the familiar shape of someone arriving in crisis and needing someone who would not flinch from the weight of that. She heard the doors, and she heard the team moving, and she heard Alicia Park's voice asking the right questions in the right order, and she was already moving toward it before she'd decided to move, which was how it always worked when you'd found the thing that was genuinely yours. Not the name, not the title, not the recognition, though the recognition had mattered more than she'd expected it to, not because she'd needed it to know her own worth, but because there was a specific kind of damage that came from existing in a world that had decided you were gone. And having that world correct itself was its own healing, separate from anything she'd done internally. What was hers was the work. What was hers was the particular combination of things she could do and do well. The hands and the training and the 4 years of nursing and the decade before that and the specific hard-won knowledge that people in crisis needed someone who could hold steady when everything else was moving. She'd spent 4 years keeping that skill alive in a borrowed name in a city that didn't know her. She was going to spend the next chapter doing it as herself. The ambulance doors opened,